strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on our weekly flagship show, Talking Point, we're looking at the India-Australia ECTA. ECTA or ECTA, our experts tonight have been closely associated with India-Australia ties and taking it to a new level. Joining us from Srinagar is Professor Amitabh Mattoo. He's a professor at CIPOD, the Center for International Politics Organization and Disarmament at SIS in JNU. He's also honorary professor in the University of Melbourne, an ex-NSAB member, and has been the director of the Australia-India Institute. Professor Mattoo, good to see you, sir.
Great to see you, Amitabh.
And joining us all the way from Sydney, so we're in effect connecting Srinagar and Sydney, is Natasha Bhaskar. She's joining StratNews Global for the first time, but is a well-known personality in India-Australia affairs. She's general manager at Newland Global Group. And another person who is in Australia who actually recommended your name, Natasha, Salvatore Borbones, says, my three favorite people all on the same show. So that's a good start. But I do apologize, Natasha, for keeping you awake so late at night. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for the opportunity, Amitabh, and I'm enjoying and I'm looking forward to a great conversation today. Thank you.
The pleasure's all ours. Professor Mattoo, I mean, lots of words and statements have been used about ECTA or unity or ECTA, historic, pivotal, watershed. The strategic message of it is as important as the economic content, I think an ambassador said. This is India's first trade agreement with a developed country in almost a decade. But what are the factors that have coalesced to make it possible? Why now, Professor?
I think most important, this has the imprimatur of Prime Minister Modi himself. He actually believes in the India-Australia relationship in a comprehensive sense. He believes that there's a convergence of values and interests, so much so that while negotiators were, as negotiators are, niggardly about every comma, every full stop, he said he wanted it done. And he actually coined the name. It's ECTA, but also IndAus, Indus, as strong, resilient, and mighty as the river Indus, the unity of India and Australia. So it's his nomenclature, it's his political heft and weight, and it's his vision. Ever since he came as Prime Minister in 2014, he has believed in this relationship. You've had three successive Prime Ministers in Australia, Tony Abbott, and then Malcolm Turnbull, and now Scott Morrison. He's made it a point to get along with all three of them. Of course, it helped that Abbott was chosen as a special trade envoy by Canberra to help kind of smooth the way and pave the way for the deal. But I believe that Prime Minister himself believes in this relationship, has always believed in it. In fact, even before he became Prime Minister, he had visited Australia and recognized the potential of this relationship.
Right, Natasha, apart from the two leaders who were involved, and then, of course, as you go down the ladder, so to speak, but there has been momentum that's been gained in India-Australia relations since, June 2020, when it was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So why have ties consolidated so much so fast? Apart from the leaders, are there any global factors?
Oh, several of them, Amitabh, I would say. And as you rightly said, since the elevation of ties to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020, if we look at what really has happened, China is no longer Australia's best trading friend, and COVID has spared none. And that became a reason, to identify ways in which both countries can engage with each other. Now, host of activities, a lot of MOUs, agreements have come through since 2020. In fact, to an extent, the second virtual summit that happened in March, both the sides agreed to have an institutionalized arrangement of annual summits between the heads of state. But what we witness is a very holistic engagement now, unlike the focus primarily on just one dimension of the relationship, be it strategic or be it diaspora. The focus with the trade deal has also gone on economic quotient, something which was lacking in the relationship for long. Just to give a sense of the targets, the bilateral trade sitting at around $27.5 billion at this stage, and the focus is to take it to $45 billion in the next 5 years. And interestingly, the fact that the Commerce Minister been visiting Australia and was here, we met him yesterday. He mentioned, and when he got aware of Australia's trade with China and the scale of that trade, which runs around $230 to $240 billion, he said we are aiming for $130 billion by 2030. So the aim is going, higher and higher, with a clear sense that what India wants and what Australia can offer, and the sense of maitri and mateship, very visible across, all the platforms where we saw both the trade ministers hand in hand talking about things, what needs to be done. And if I may, tell you about the event that happened in Sydney yesterday. So the Business Council of Australia hosted the event where Dan Tehan said that when the negotiations were happening, and he was at that time also in the United States, there were leaders asking him what's the status of the deal. He was getting calls from UK to know what's really happening, and that says also the kind of global attention which was on this deal, where the deal is headed, and how it's really going to shape going forward, and the charisma of all this in terms of bringing the corporate Australia's attention, I would say, Amitabh, and I'm looking forward to discuss that component, a component that's been seriously lacking in this relationship, to get corporate Australia interested in the India growth story. That's something was very categorically focused. So momentum has gained, and it's only, as you say, the fact that wines and the import duties on wines has also, gone down, not significantly, but in a span of 3, 5, 7, 10 years, seems like it's only going to get better from here.
It's only going to get better. Professor Mattoo, like Natasha's pointing out there, Piyush Goyal has just headed a huge, large, or should I say, a business delegation there. Both sides, both ministers actually acknowledging that movement in the Quad has helped movement on the trade front.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear, Amitabh, that there is a convergence at multiple levels. As Natasha pointed out, the rise of China in the manner in which it is risen under Xi Jinping, which is as a hegemonic power, belligerent to the extreme. Australia has faced the brunt of Chinese aggressiveness. And so I think there's a recognition within Canberra that this huge reliance on China economically and in terms of trade was counterproductive. Simultaneously, during COVID, the whole supply chain and the need to diversify became evident to all the Quad partners. So on the strategic level, on the political level, this chemistry amongst the leadership. On the economic level, there's complementarity. For the last 20 years that I know, at least, every economist who's forecasted or who's looked at modeling this relationship says there are absolute gains. And of course, there are relative gains across sectors, which might be greater for one and less for the other. But in absolute terms, the gains for both countries. And more importantly, this trade deal itself is in compliance with WTO rules regarding free trade, Article 24 of GATT, which says that you should over time then remove duties and subsidies on most of your trading commodities. Then the other component, which Natasha represents and which I represent in at least half measure, is the diaspora. You have a growing influential community of people on both sides who are champions for the relationship, who believe in this relationship. Now contrast this for the last 70 years. Initially, you had Australia and India on opposing sides of the Cold War. India's economic policies were autarkic. Australia was part of the capitalist-led American alliance. India was not aligned, but at least had a special relationship with the Soviet Union. But even after the Cold War ended, the relationship didn't take off because the chemistry wasn't there, the correlation forces wasn't there. Remember, Amitabh, and you'll remember that starkly that when India conducted its nuclear tests, the
Yeah.
most ferocious reaction came from the Australians, to the point that we described them as the deputy sheriff of the United States. Similarly, attacks on Indian students in Melbourne derailed the relationship. But today, the bandwidth of the relationship is so strong that even though India and Australia see the situation in Ukraine and Russia differently, it's not impacted on the trade deal. In fact, it was concluded with remarkable alacrity, despite concerns about differences about what's happening and why India is in the West generally, why India is importing concessional oil from Russia and why it's not actually condemning and rather than just abstaining. So there is a greater understanding of each one's difficulties, each one's limitations, and that's what real friendships and partnerships are all about. Not that there are agreements across the board, but that fundamentally you understand and agree with each other. But you'll also realize, like in any good partnership, that there will be moments of difference, and you have to tackle those in the spirit of that friendship, through talking to each other, through having the conversation, through trying to see how you can actually move ahead without disrupting your relationship.
Natasha, I'll just talk about the agreements in specific and how they are benefiting both countries. But just to get the disagreements or the sticking points out of the picture first, Jaydeep Badavi asking dairy is excluded from tariff lines. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But if you can speak about the differences or the issues that weren't agreed to. And also, is there bipartisan support in Australia for this deal? I mean, will it be ratified no matter what happens after the elections?
Yes, totally. Because, in terms of the reactions which we are getting here, see, policy continuity is something which governments always follow. And at this stage, it's clear that, even if the government changes, because we are due for elections in Australia, there will be a proper ratification. So we're looking at a time span of at least 3 to 4 months from now for the interim trade agreement to be accepted, following which there's already a subcommittee which will be formed, which is being formed after the signing of the interim trade agreement of around in a gap of 60 to 70 days, which will start contemplating on the comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, which is the full agreement to address issues like procurement, digital trade, and several other aspects which have not been covered in this deal. But the larger sense across different parties is that this is a deal which was bound to happen, and it finally breaks the 10-year long 10-year jinx in a way of the fact that the deal could not come through across because of several reasons. What in terms of sensitive sectors from the Indian perspective, we need to understand here that it's always been a very, very tightrope walk between ensuring and safeguarding domestic interests with making economic gains. And what's very clear with the trade minister, the commerce minister's visit to Australia this time, and the message which is very common and the common theme across all the addresses he has given, be it Melbourne, Sydney, and today in Perth, is that India is ready for business and India does not fear free trade anymore. And what was very interesting, to notice here, Amitabh, was that all the deliberations, all the addresses were centered around that how India can offer you opportunity. Come to India. India is ready for business. It offers you a manufacturing opportunity. It offers you scale. And it's coming from a point where we are ready to do business. We are ready to strike a deal with you. If the deals are equitable, if the deals are non-discriminatory, if the deals are reciprocal in nature. So this is an India, which is a new India, which is speaking from a position of strength, which is speaking from and asking what is in it for me. And that message, I would say, has gone categorically been reflected across all his addresses, even the engagements, because, during our discussions with the businesses around the corporate Australia's reaction, it's a very interesting departure. It's not something that we are asking you to come and in a way the tone and tenor is very different. It's about it's your choice now. India is no longer an option. You got to make it an informed choice if you want to scale up your engagement. So that's something which we felt is very, very promising when it comes to the Australia-India economic engagement at this stage, and also India's global economic integration, if I may say so, Amitabh.
Right. Talking about global integration, Professor, you talked about China and China's aggressive rise. Now, I mean, the India-Australia trade deal in its current phase, or even if it moves to SICA as it's proposed by the end of the year, there's no way that India can, replace China as Australia's main trade partner, considering the weights that the two economies have. So it's a small step, not a solution to escalating trade tensions with China and Australia. Professor?
No, I think initially I agree with you. It's not going to be instant magic. There's no magic mantra to immediately get over the dependence which has been built across the last 20 years or more to China in terms of Chinese manufacturing goods. And indeed, the Australian economy's great success was because of the hunger for raw materials in China. But simultaneously, there is a hunger, maybe not the same appetite within India for Australian raw materials. And hopefully, gradually, I think you will open up more sectors. India, let's face it, is not the easiest country to do business with even today. In terms of our ease of business, it still ranks not amongst the highest or the easiest places to do business in the world. But once you have now actually signed a free trade agreement, it's incumbent that the political leadership ensures that Australian investors ride on the wave of this new optimism. The real test for me, we have crossed the Rubicon, but the real test for me of really crossing the Ganges or the Indus would be if pension funds, huge pension funds in Australia, which earn a fraction of the interest that you would earn in India, are willing to actually invest in the Indian financial system, Indian markets, Indian capital markets, because that would suggest that you trust the Indian economy enough to be predictable, to be resilient, that you're willing to invest the most sensitive part of your economic surplus into India. So I think there is work happening in that, and that would actually contribute to getting huge capital flows for building our infrastructure. So that is the real prize. That's on the road. Of course, there are things like you and I, we can enjoy a glass of probably wine at a cheaper price, or eat your smash avocados in the breakfast rather than get them from Bangalore, at least in Srinagar. But apart from that, the farming sector is one in which we are, for obvious reasons, given also what's happened over the last years, particularly uncomfortable with opening it up. Hopefully, I think that sense of insecurity and protectionism within the Indian farming sector will also gradually be corrected, and the Indian farmers will become much more confident of their own produce to be able to become more competitive. But until then, I think for the farming sector is generally one which will continue to be protected. But I think it's a fantastic deal also because it signals, as Natasha, for instance, pointed out, that we are not now against deals. We had put all bilateral trade deals on the back burner. We were not in favor of the RCEP because that was seen as a Chinese initiative and a Chinese-dominated multilateral trade agreement. But here is now a country, as you pointed out, a developed country, a Western country in Asia, with whom you have signed a deal. It may not be the perfect deal, but it's a perfect deal in the making. And it has the backing of the Commerce Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and ultimately the two Prime Ministers. Just a point about bipartisan, I think there is a bullishness about India across parties. There might be a certain degree of greater sensitivity to China or less bullishness if there is a Labour government. And as of today, if you were to ask me if I was a gambling person, I would say that Labour has a greater chance of winning the next election. But you have Penny Wong, who's also someone who understands India and who has a certain empathy for what India stands for. So hopefully, I think it will be all for the good.
This is a question that was addressed to Professor Mattoo. I'll come back to him. But Natasha, on RCEP itself, Prakhar asks, do you think the trade deal with Australia offsets India's absence from RCEP to a certain extent, or there is another group of analysts who says, yes, China weaponizing trade, but for India, piecemeal agreements with individual RCEP members will not substitute for being a member of RCEP. Where do you stand, Natasha?
Well, I would say it will definitely not substitute. A multilateral agreement will not really, an absence of a multilateral agreement will not really, the gains from that will substitute from a bilateral agreement. But at this stage, I would say that, looking the way the government is very proactively and positive about signing free trade agreements, it would want to, focus on what sort of gains are being made with these bilateral agreements. So, going by the history of it, considering the trade deficits which we have had in the past with ASEAN nations or with Japan and China with the trade deficit and the cautious nature of the government to not to be doing deals without making sure that what are the rules of origin and what's in it in terms of investor protection and clauses like that. It's important for the government at this stage, and it will most likely focus on what it is getting from these bilateral deals before actually even considering going ahead for these multilateral agreements. And if that has to happen, it might just consider APEC to start with, because Australia might lobby there for India as an opportunity, considering the deal has just been signed. So too hard to say at this stage, I would say, for India to agree to RCEP negotiations until and unless it's not very sure what gains are being made.
Salvatore, Professor Mattoo has this point to make. He says, what's in the deal for India? It seems to me that for India, this is more a visa deal, not a trade deal.
My friend Salvatore is one of the most incisive observers of India-Australia relations, but also a great strategic thinker. In fact, Salvatore, really the question often asked is what is in it for Australia in this deal? Because India seems to have got everything it asked for. But frankly speaking, it's a win-win for India, because apart from the fact that you will have chefs and yoga teachers and students getting more employment, I think there's greater market access. True, I mean, the Australian market is not the biggest in the world, but I think even then, because it's a high quality niche market, there will be a huge number of areas where India will be able to make its presence. So I genuinely believe that this is a win-win deal. And the payoffs are maybe different in terms of across sectors, as I pointed out. But overall, it's good for India, it's good for Australia, it's good for both economies, and it's good for them in a larger strategic, comprehensive sense. I can't see a downside. Salvatore, my question to you is, where is the downside?
If
What
I can
has
just
India
come here. Yeah, and I think a very insightful remark from Professor Mattoo. But Salvatore, if I can just come here, just in terms of the figures that we are looking at, 96.4%, zero duty access for Indian exports to Australia. But interestingly, also for the pharmaceutical sector, because this is going to open up around $12 billion of pharmaceutical market for India. So that's like a huge market access. Even from textile exports, we are looking at tripling down to $1.1 billion within 3 years, which is likely to create around 40,000 jobs just in the textile sector. If you look at engineering exports, that is likely to jump from $1.2 billion to $2.7 billion in 5 years. And the minister has been talking about that there's a forecast to create around 1 million jobs in India. So that should, technically give a sense of what this really means for India, in a big way. And the fact that the minister has been very cautious that for the exports has to go up for the country. We are a very consumption-driven market. And the transition has to happen from consumption to exports. The figures right now already suggest that India has crossed over $413 billion of exports just in the last financial year. And the focus is how do you take it to the next level? And these sort of free trade deals are going to bring in export competitiveness, trade competitiveness, incentivize other countries to invest in the India market, incentivize other countries to manufacture the India market, and also, bring in new incentives and new initiatives, if that answers your question, Salvatore.
And if I can add,
he has a quick response at the bottom of your screens also, Salvatore. He says, thank you, Professor Mattoo. What's in it for Australia? ? Morrison has got a front page headline in the Weekend Australian. India deal eases China pain. There's an election next month.
And if I could say tongue in cheek, Salvatore, you'll be able to get your many girlfriends nice emerald necklaces from India at a discounted price.
Now, from emeralds to another commodity, if I'm not mistaken, what 70% of imports, Professor Mattoo, of Australian imports are coal, right? Uh,
Yes.
how big a change will that be for India in the current situation?
I think the fact is that, of course, unfettered access to Australian coal or Australian duties or Indian duties coming down. And some people say, "Oh, this would happen in any case," but I think it's a signal that we want Australian coal, and this could gradually be transferred to other minerals as well. Coal is not the best example, but I think
Mhm.
it's a signaling which is very important because. It suggests that you can actually uh, waive duties to the point where you can get unfettered access to the Indian market. So, frankly, as I said, yes, I doubt whether Morrison can win. Salvatore, more seriously, I doubt whether Morrison can win this election on the back of an India trade deal. But we can take a offline bet on that.
I should have got Salvatore also online so that he could have had these comments directly with you. But if you want to take that on coal, if you want to add anything to that, and also Natasha, there's a specific question for you from Carl Jalson. I think, do you foresee opposition from domestic lobbies who will want to keep their products out of deals with states having competing suppliers?
Can you repeat that question, Amitabh?
Do you foresee opposition from domestic lobbies who will want to keep their products out of deals with states having competing supplier states, I presume meaning countries?
Right. So this is from the India perspective. So, at this stage, I think, what the minister has negotiated and has been negotiating across, different countries seems to be very safe for Indian domestic suppliers and gives enough opportunity for, the country to buy some time and get their, be competitive from the trade front. But just coming back to, Professor Mattoo's point on coal, there was, I remember, only just yesterday we were having these discussions, and there was someone who said, from the Indian side that on the 20th of March, looked like that the deal will not go through. And because of the negotiations which weren't moving ahead. And first was the wine factor, and the second was the coal factor with 2.5% of import duty. Now, in the India Economic Strategy report of Peter Verghese, which actually offers a very categorical roadmap of how Australia should be engaging with India, which was reciprocated by Ambassador Anil Wadhwa's report, there's a very there are paragraphs written on how for India, which is whose tax to GDP ratio is very low, and the compliance factor struggles. India generally, depends on revenue mechanism, and that revenues actually come from these import duties. So to actually go down and not agree to or getting rid of these import duties will be a big challenge. So that was the fear which Peter Verghese had written in his report, and that told us in a way that it would not have been an easy negotiation, especially on the coal front, getting rid of the immediate revenues that comes from the import duties. So a big breakthrough there, and the pressure primarily came in, as Professor Mattoo earlier mentioned, from the virtual summit for the bureaucracy, that the political leaders have declared that the deal is happening, and the bureaucracy will have to get its acts together to deliver.
Getting his act together. Like you said, Professor Mattoo, I mean, coal is not a perfect example, but that's the current situation. But also, critically, and Australia has what, reserves of at least 21 of the 49 critical minerals that the Indian government has identified are needed?
Yes, absolutely. And more importantly, I think, just to take a little breather from the trade deal, Amitabh, because I know that would be keenly observing this. The virtual summit that took place on 21st of March actually signaled also the possibilities of real-time intelligence operations, including, as reported in the Australian press, that the Poseidon, Indian Poseidons could be used for surveillance in various parts of interest where the Chinese have a presence. So it's really trade is only a part of a canvas that is being gradually painted. One shouldn't just miss the tree for the woods. Look at this huge landscape that's being painted, and the trade will get more color, will get more energy once it starts moving, because there is a momentum. You see, it's something, business to business has a momentum of its own. It's the third B which often creates problems. Those are the bureaucrats. Once you take away the bureaucrats and let the businesses work together, you will see this relationship, the economic relationship, grow. But unlike the defense relationship, which has to be driven by the armed forces, by the security sector, so it's not just the business relationship, it's the security relationship, the political relationship, the soft power relationship. You tell me, on is there a single substantive global issue other than the Ukraine issue right now on which India and Australia think dramatically differently? I can't think of single one. I keep quizzing myself. I say, is there a thing that you can say really separates us so dramatically? There's nothing. It's complete complementarity of Weltanschauung's worldviews. It's a little India in the Indian Ocean.
Since you brought up P8Is, Poseidon, this question is for you, Professor. Meghdut Bakale says, any possibilities of India joining AUKUS hypersonic missile deal, as the US has shown its intentions to lower India's dependency on Russian defense equipment?
I think if you see, because all this is often been talk. If the one way for India to slow down its relationship of dependence with the Russians is for the Americans to actually walk the talk. If the Americans are ready to walk the talk in terms of access to technology, especially dual use technology, and the latest in defense equipment, I can't see any reason why one would depend on the Russians. It's just that the Russians have been reliable, dependable suppliers of armed forces equipment and continue to be one, despite the fact that their equipment is often aging, not the latest. But they're kind of an old shop that you go to because you know the father, you know the son, you know they'll give you a discount, and you got used to that. And you're not used to the new glitzy mall, which may offer you better goods. But so America has to actually demonstrate. If it does, I'm sure that will be the way out. In fact, it should be the way out for the future. Because frankly speaking, I mean, the way Putin in Russia is going, there are lots of question marks in everyone's mind, even those who've grown up like Russophiles through much of the Cold War.
Natasha, if there are any points you want to bring up from what we were discussing earlier, or there's a question for you also from Govind Upman, who says, will this deal help India tackle some of the problems that hamper India's manufacturing from becoming competitive with respect to China or Vietnam?
Well, that's a great question, I would say, Govind, because that's what we are trying to address here. That's what India is trying to address here in terms of how it can really, emerge as a solid manufacturing base for foreign countries, for foreign companies, and that's something which the Trade Minister, the Commerce Minister, repeatedly said on all the platforms, that we are asking Australian companies to come to India, manufacture in India, and export it from India to other countries, and that's what it's trying to promote in a big way. But in terms of, because you mentioned the multilateral partnership earlier, from the perspective of RCEP, I see that multilateral partnership can emerge from the Quad partnership, because the economic pillar of Quad is something which still, at a very, very early stage, and something that can be discussed. We do have working groups on climate change, on vaccine partnership, on clean technology, on cyber and critical technology. But that's where a big opportunity lies, where you're looking at a combined GDP of around $34 trillion between US, Japan, Australia, and India. And there are, interdependencies which can be easily explored. For example, if India needs, raw materials for infrastructure, Australia has all the raw materials. If you're looking for pharmaceutical connections, APIs, US can offer all the APIs. So that's sort of an interdependencies can be easily explored in the Quad partnership, and that can be a starting point, I believe, for a multilateral partnership between both countries. But Amitabh, in terms of question of corporate Australia, because that's something remains a huge challenge even at this stage. The trade deal is fine. Both the ministers have been very proactive, very positive about what this brings in terms of exports and trade in exports and trade in services, but what it means for investment. Because if you look at the current data, we are looking at 0.6% of Australia's outward investment to India, which is lower than Australia's investment in Bermuda, PNG, Netherlands, or even Luxembourg. So that tells you a story, and I'm glad Professor Mattoo brought that point about the investment funds. Yes, the investment funds have been very cautious, not very happy about investing. We do have examples of Australian Super and Macquarie Capital earlier, but the current MOU and the current announcement of offering same interest rates to the investment funds here in Australia to India, how far that will really get translated in terms of investment is something remains to be seen. And what the political leadership has clearly gone on record to say is that we have done our bit, we have done what we could do for you. Now it's for businesses to show courage and walk the talk, and to follow and make the economic engagement a reality. And that's where the corporate Australia will have to fight their anecdotal assumptions on India, have to be more aware of the new reforms that are happening in India, which I personally feel has been a big issue. Most of them are still, in a way, have a very antiquated sense of India, and still feel that changes aren't happening. What sort of reforms are happening, what sort of changes have happened. So I would imagine that the kind of allocation that has happened from Australia, around $280 million, and the kind of announcements been made across diverse sectors, from technology to innovation to manufacturing to education partnerships, tourism. You say it, and that is there. And also with the latest India economic strategy update, which is very categorical about post-COVID economic recovery, measures. It'll be good to, really initiate a kind of a roadshow to make, the businesses more aware of the kind of changes that are happening in India. So it's no longer about opportunity in India, it's about how to in India. That's the next level. How do you do business in India? Opportunity India is very understood. The opportunity story is very clear, Amitabh.
Right. Professor, if you want to just wrap up your thoughts with a thought that Natasha brought up earlier, in terms of the Australian Trade Minister had spoken about when he was in the US, the USTR was in touch with him, the UK counterparts, Canada counterparts. Is there a template that can be followed, or if not necessarily straitjacketed, but things that were problems before and have been resolved here? Can India hold them out? The US, the UK, Canada, everyone else say, see, this can be done.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest signal, because I saw commentators from UK say, oh, the biggest thing about this deal is that India signed it, that India is such a reluctant deal maker, that to get India to actually sign off on a bilateral trade agreement is an achievement by itself. And this does serve as a model, or as a template. Of course, circumstances are different, economies are different, but certainly with countries with which you also share other things. For instance, Israel, UAE, Canada, UK. I mean, I know the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, spoke about how the 5 relationships which have transformed during the Modi years are Japan, Australia, UAE, Israel, and of course the United States. And if you add UK and Canada to them, and you can see that while strategically there is a greater closeness and convergence, if you could actually give these relationships more economic depth, then there would be a momentum which would be far greater than what could be provided only through the political convergences. So yes, this is a signaling that India is ready to sign on to deals, even though it's not patently obvious that there are, as Salvatore said, there are huge gains, but I believe that there are huge gains, and that it is willing to actually compromise in certain sectors if need be. and that these deals are fully compliance with WTO rules and guidelines and GATT rules, which regarding free trade deals. So, and while India might be still uncomfortable with sub-regional multilateral economic arrangements which are dominated by one big power, because obviously your influence to be able to negotiate an agreement in a multilateral framework where you are not the dominant partner is much lesser. Therefore, India values a bilateral deal much more. It's important now for other countries to pick on this momentum. Australia has shown the way. It's for others now to see this as a window open or a door open and walk into it.
Natasha, Govind thanks you for your last comprehensive answer. But if you want to just wrap up your thoughts on this particular episode.
Thanks, Amitabh. And I would say that, I'll go back to from where we started about Prime Minister Modi's visit to Australia in 2014 after a gap of 28 years, and where he announced, in the joint session of Parliament in Canberra that Australia was no longer at the periphery of India's vision, but at the center of its thoughts. And seems like that's turning into a reality now in terms of engagement that's happening across different sectors. And being part of the Australian Indian diaspora, I would say that the diaspora is also equally, excited and enthusiastic about engaging. Australia has also released a categorical diaspora report to identify and map the diaspora potential, because there's this clear understanding that the network skills and capabilities that the diaspora can bring to Australia to really take this relationship to the next level is of great use, and that's something which needs to be harnessed. So diaspora diplomacy is another component of this relationship which is being explored at a big level. But overall, the key message, I would say, Amitabh, is that not to look at this relationship from a buyer-supplier partnership, from a buyer-supplier viewpoint. It has to be capacity-driven. It has to be from a model where Australia offers a development anchor kind of a model for India, which is aspirational, which is growing, and is looking for partnerships, not just for a basic, a trade engagement. And that sort of shift, I would say, is happening with all the energy which we are seeing around.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thanks so much, Natasha. I was just pulling up, since we started with Salvatore, let's end with him as well. He says, you've all been far too nice to me. Thank you, and thanks for a great show. So, Natasha, thank you for your time, especially, I do know it's past midnight in Sydney. Thanks again, Natasha.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's been a pleasure. And thank you, Salvatore. Thank you, Professor Mattoo.
And Professor Mattoo, of course, it has been a great pleasure, as usual, having you on, connecting Sydney to Srinagar. Thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you, Natasha. Great to be on the show.
And just a reminder to all our viewers to follow our social media handles for the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so, and do spread the word. If you like this video, do press the thumbs up on YouTube. Share this link with your personal and professional colleagues, and I'm also putting up a link, UPI payment link, that if you need or would like to support us financially. This is Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.